But welcome, my name is Natalie Evans and I'm Deputy Director at Policy Exchange. Delighted to be joined by a distinguished panel here this evening. Obviously, in the age of austerity, there are some big decisions to be made, and previous fiscal consolidations, both in the UK and abroad, have seen transport as one of the big losers when it comes to public spending cuts. But with much of our infrastructure in urgent need of upgrading and improvement, how is this going to happen in the current fiscal climate? And can private investment, for instance, help to fill some of the funding gap, and what can be done to encourage and incentivise it? To discuss some of these issues, I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Lillicoat at the end there, who's Policy Exchange's Chief Economist, Ed Wilson, who's Head of Public Affairs at Network Rail, and Stephen Joseph, who's Executive Director at the Campaign for Better Transport. So what we'll do is each of our panellists will speak for a few minutes, and then we'll open up to questions and discussion. So I'm going to start off with Andrew.
Hello then. A paradox. Public spending must be cut, rather a lot, and it's thought that we need many tens of billions spent on transport infrastructure. And this is a challenging combination of facts. One might think that the answer was, well, cut something else. But in fact, what tends to happen in major fiscal consolidations, we've studied quite a few through history and around the world, is that transport infrastructure spending is one of the main things that gets cut. And there's some pretty straightforward reasons why. Now, it's tempting to suppose that when you have a significant recession, particularly one that's involved with deflationary risk, and you have a period of very low interest rates, that's a good opportunity. Right? So you might borrow at the very low interest rates and then invest in transport infrastructure. But governments tend not to do that. Why don't they do that? Well, because when governments have done that, it's tended to work out very badly. Right? The stuff that they spent the money on tended to be wasted. A classic example is Japan in the 1990s and through the 2000s. What happened there was that they borrowed a great deal of money, so they ran up something like 200% of GDP as their debt, and they spent a lot of money, of course, including on lots of fancy transport schemes. And the reality is that what they did with the money was that they built lots of roads, which are very shiny, and bridges that were very shiny, and they're still very shiny because people didn't use them. Because one of the realities of significant recessions is that you have them because something has changed. When the kinds of things that have changed in these circumstances are that the structure of economies or demographic features or other kinds of expectations that you had about the past no longer apply. So just extrapolating from past trends or going with established expectations will tend to mislead you. You just don't know enough about what's going to be happening out there in the future to be able to work out what the right places are to invest your money. And that applies also to things like building lots of houses or building lots of hospitals or other kinds of infrastructure spending. If you overcommit during significant recessions, you find that the stuff that you built wasn't really worth that much when it comes to it. So that means that in addition to the infrastructure spend just narrowly in terms of transport, also things which are associated, which might drive transport demand, like the location of housing, socially subsidised housing and so on. It's also very difficult to know where to spend money on those things. Now, in the same way, of course, private sector investment is also likely to fall in this period, because the same kind of uncertainties which apply to the public sector are also going to apply to the private sector. So, although it's tempting, and although it's probably true to say that if you withdraw public investment of various sorts, then there'll be some growth in private investment to replace that, it's unlikely that the net effect of these is going to be an increase in investment. It's very likely that you're going to find a fall in investment. So a common cliche is to say, well, what we should do, therefore, is to try to create great certainty for private investment. So we want to have that the government either commits in some way to funding certain schemes, or perhaps that the government acts as a guarantor to assist with private sector investment. Those are common things that people call for in these circumstances. But a risk of that, of course, is that the government then gets tied in with some plan or some scheme, which then proves to be a really bad idea. So what you've done then is that in a situation in which money is already very tight and there's a great premium on value added, you get stuck with things that you don't really want. Now, that's neither very credible, in the sense that it's not very likely that the government would actually stick to its commitments if it found that things were going bad, nor does it seem to be very wise. So, what government can do in these circumstances is to embrace the changed circumstances and to try to work out more of what those circumstances are. Now, it knows its own policies a little bit better than the private sector does, and it can use that knowledge to forecast better than the private sector could by itself. So it can work out what's really likely to be needed, given the new uncertainties, and also what the uncertainties and dependencies involved are, right? Which bits of its own policy decisions or what other kinds of dependencies are really crucial. So another thing is that it needs to be ruthless in pruning back where schemes are doubtful, and focus where certainty is greatest and value added is clearest, so that it places itself in a position such that once uncertainties are resolved, then it can commit decisively. The thing you definitely don't want to happen is that you start to have some kind of resolution of uncertainty, then government sets off down the path, and then it decides that that isn't credible because, for example, it starts to invest in something that then it turns out that actually it hadn't cut spending enough at an earlier stage, so then it cuts back on that again. That can really kibosh private sector investment, because the private sector then thinks that it knows what government's going to do, and the government changes its mind. So that kind of uncertainty is something which the government can seek to resolve a little bit. So you don't want to have policy volatility. Now, I suspect that the 2010s will be an era of great volatility, both in terms of economic and social aspects. So I'd just like to finish by identifying what I see as a few of the key uncertainties and dependencies are likely to be. So I think that there are uncertainties over issues such as inflation, growth, including regional growth, migration, both internal migration and immigration, and emigration, of course, as well. House prices and construction, and hence location decisions of various sorts related to where houses are. Employment and unemployment. Future industrial mix. So what sorts of companies you're going to have where, and the future export focus. So where are we going to be exporting stuff to? So I see those as all being key uncertainties. Key dependencies that I would identify that are relevant for transport investment include the government's resolution of spending cuts, that is, that it really sticks to its plans and it doesn't backtrack. Regional policy. One of the consequences of having large spending cuts is that some regional policies, much of which have actually been a pretty abject failure, but much of the funds associated with regional policies are likely to be withdrawn. That's just a reality. That's just a straightforward place where you can recover some money. There's also, though, just on that note as well, there's another possibility, which of course is that you finally withdraw some money in regional policy, and then you decide that a region becomes particularly depressed. So you then change your mind and you go back to putting money into that. So there's a clear governmental dependency there in terms of regional policy. Another thing is pension ages, and hence demographic mix effects, and the government obviously has some control over that. Social housing policies and industrial policy. So going back to that question of what industrial mix the government really seeks. So if the government could reflect upon and establish credible scenarios for the uncertainties and resolve as soon as it was appropriate to do so, some of the dependencies, then the position for transport investment would be greatly clarified, and you'd be in a much better position to work out where transport investment will be best placed and to invest with freedom and confidence.
Thank you, Andrew. Stephen.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'll go straight on from what Andrew said, because none of what he's described is what the Department for Transport does traditionally. And in fact, it does almost the opposite of everything he's just said. And this has been a battleground for us as a group for a number of years, and certainly a large number of other people, including a number of other political parties, the Green Alliance and now Network Rail, have joined the battle. So I don't imagine Andrew's looked in detail at how the Department for Transport operates in terms of future-proofing its policies, forecasting and appraisal. So I'll just describe some of the things that it does, which are exactly, and I absolutely agree with Andrew about planning for uncertainty and what that means in terms of what schemes and funding you prioritise, and that's certainly something we've done a lot of work on. So let's just go through the sort of things. I was jotting down as he was talking about the things the Department of Transport does and which new ministers would have been presented with. Does it look at trend breaks and future uncertainty? No, it doesn't. Still, there's a foundation of everything that the rail industry assembled here and others are told to do is plan on the basis of past trends continuing. On the basis, and still at the foundation of everything, is a national transport model based on national road traffic forecasts that work on the basis of past growth in road traffic in particular, and to an extent aviation and other things, other trends continuing, to Los Angeles levels of saturation levels of car ownership. Now, in practice, we know that a lot of that isn't going to happen. And in fact, there are some academics who are now talking about us having reached the age of peak car, particularly in the inner areas of large cities, and that we've seen a trend away from that. It also has, of course, for the rail industry, completely taken the government by surprise over the last 15 years, because having planned since the 1960s and 70s and into the 80s, and then planned rail privatisation on the basis of stable rail patronage on passenger and freight, if not absolute decline, they've been met by a massive growth in rail patronage. And we've just put some evidence into the Transport Select Committee, which apparently I'm not supposed to talk about because you get hauled up to Tyre or something. But one of the things we've done is to chart the fact that, exactly as Andrew has said, there has been a breaking trend of the kind of growth we've had in the last 15 to 20 years, where road traffic has grown underneath GDP, particularly car traffic, has grown below level GDP, and rail has grown above GDP, and that growth was interrupted by Hatfield and its aftermath, but has now resumed and is above that. And certainly, for example, to take a particular example, traffic across the docks in Felixstowe, rail freight has hardly declined, has remained stable, whereas road freight has declined significantly. So you've seen a break in trend. So you have a position where exactly none of the uncertainties that Andrew has talked about are being reflected. There's no scenarios. And actually, I would add to the scenarios that Andrew has presented, the whole issue of climate change and oil prices. Both of those are giant uncertainties. None of which are the ranges of oil prices are not in the Department of Transport's forecasting, for instance. So supposing you get an oil price spike of another $150, $200 a barrel, maybe. None of that is in the forecasting. We actually did some work with the consultants of Peter Brett Associates, which we took a particular scheme, which was the Luton Northern Bypass. It could have been any road scheme, and we actually said, supposing you did something different, which is exactly what Andrew was suggesting, ranges of uncertainty, what would be the consequence, and what would be the kinds of schemes you would invest in that area, including, incidentally, uncertainties about the housing that the bypass was being planned around did or didn't happen in different ways. So actually, and then if you add to that forecasting, something I know Ed will talk about, the way in which the Department of Transport appraises schemes, where you give very high priority to very small time savings, discounted over 60 years, assuming on that background traffic growth, you get a situation where what you end up with is prioritisation. We know this because actually Norman Baker was talking about it at the conference last week. What he's been presented with is a list of very large road schemes in the southeast, because that's what past trends continue, because that's where the growth has been. So actually, one of the things that I think needs to happen is a wholesale overhaul of what kind of appraisal and forecasting the department does. And in transport terms, it needs to move away from forecasting against past trends and to do scenario planning based on exactly the kinds of uncertainties that Andrew was talking about. What does that mean in terms of the schemes you would prioritise? You would prioritise schemes that give you quick returns in the next few years, because those are the ones that are going to be robust against any of the kinds of uncertainties you talk about. That means, for example, a lot of small-scale rail schemes look good in these terms, and actually the work that Ed's going to talk about just against that. You would also talk about some of what's known as what used to be called smarter choice schemes, but sustainable transport schemes of all kinds at local level, because what that does, that brings you a large scale. There are no regrets schemes because they're aimed at decongestion and at a range of and at tackling a range of local and to an extent sub-regional problems. And you might invest in some larger public transport schemes, such as the tram extensions that have been going in this city, the Leeds trolleybus extensions to the Nottingham tram, those kinds of things, because they're probably good for almost any consequence of what's going to happen. What you don't do, it seems to me, is invest in legacy road schemes that have been around for a very, very long time, that are vulnerable to cost escalations, to the tiny changes in forecasting and modelling of the sort I've described, and which have suffered cost escalations far greater than anything rail track managed on the West Coast Main Line. So we've done research on one called Smarter Cuts, which suggests that you should fund a continued rail investment, bringing down costs in the rail industry. You should fund particularly bus services if you want to get people off welfare into work, and most of the unemployed do not have access to a car, so you need decent bus services. And you fund small-scale local investment in, to take a classic example that a number of people in the audience will know, a passing loop on the Suffolk line, because that will enable you to enhance the service up there. To small-scale extensions and enhancements to the rail network, extra signalling, bits of extra capacity, dealing with pinch points that will actually allow give the rail industry robustness, the strategic freight network that will allow the rail freight to expand, and so on. Those are the sorts of things that are robust against exactly the uncertainties that Andrew's been describing. Unfortunately, we'll need a new forecasting and appraisal framework from the Department for Transport if those are really going to get the priority they deserve.
Thank you very much. Ed.
Thanks. I think I can say without contradiction, mainly because he's not here, that the Shadow Secretary of State would undoubtedly agree that investing in infrastructure, transport infrastructure, particularly rail, has never been more important. I think it was striking that all the main parties, and indeed many of the fringe ones, went into the last general election with commitments to investment in transport infrastructure in their manifestos. I mean, I think that the reason that that kind of broad consensus was reached is that the conclusion came about that we simply can't afford not to invest in our transport infrastructure because of the extent to which the economy and businesses across the country rely on not just rail but transport as a whole. Now, in many ways, the railway over the last decade or so has been a victim of its own success. As Stephen says, there was the Department for Transport was planning for essentially stability or decline in terms of numbers, but in actual fact, passenger numbers are now up to 1.3 billion journeys per annum. This is 40% up, I think it is, on 10 years ago. And there's a reason for that, which is safer, it's a better performing railway. The service is more appreciated by passengers. I think that the National Passenger Survey puts satisfaction at 83% now. And I think in terms of the environment, as well as Stephen sort of touched on, that the argument for rail has actually been won, and won fairly conclusively as well. As I say, 1.3 billion passenger journeys per year. That's about 3.25 million per day, of which about 600,000 are commuters getting into London. And a vast proportion of those, a vast proportion of additional journeys are journeys being made for business. But it's not just getting people to work that is the reason that the economy relies on the railway. Every year, I see Tony Barclay's here, every year rail carries 100 million tonnes of goods between Britain's ports, its factories and its shops. And in actual fact, this reliance on rail for the economy is actually increasing, if anything. Demand is going up. The numbers of people using the railway are 40% greater than they were a decade ago, and expected to be an additional 80% on top by about 2034. Freight is up 70%, I believe, in a decade, and expected to perhaps even double by 2030. So really, there's essentially little alternative but to invest in the rail network to meet this increasing demand. And to an extent, there's no alternative, really. Again, as Steve touched on in terms of the roads, I mean, the road network, undeniably vital to British business. There's no doubt about that, but it simply can't accommodate this level of growth. The roads are full, and every year, people waste thousands of hours sat in traffic. I think Eddington estimated that the time lost to road congestion at the time of the report, so 2006, was approximately £7 to £8 billion per year. And by 2025, he estimated somewhere up to about £24 billion per year. So road congestion, is a tax on productivity that's already damaging businesses. In 2008, the CBI did a survey of which 90% of respondents to that survey said that poor reliability of the road network is having a negative impact on their business. And we really do, for this reason, need a step change in rail capacity. Now, we do have to be realistic, as Andrew touched on. The public finances are extremely tight, let's put it that way. And when competing for investment, rail faces a difficult battle. Over the next month, the government's going to make some final decisions about spending, and we do think that the coalition has indicated that it recognises the value that investment in transport infrastructure can place on economic growth as a driver for economic growth. Now, savings and efficiencies have to be found, both in enhancement programmes, but also across the industry as well, and across all sectors, frankly, not least the railway, frankly. And genuinely difficult decisions about how public money is spent must be taken. What's expendable, what's essential, and at a time of constrained funding, the need for the government to make sound decisions on investment is more critical than ever. The need to reduce the deficit and support economic growth is of paramount importance, and this must drive the investment decisions that the government takes. For the foreseeable future, anyway, we think the primary consideration for prioritising investment has to be its ability to maximise sustainable, low-carbon economic growth. Identifying the sectors and the investments that can do this is the real challenge for the government at the moment. As Stephen says, the appraisal system, we think, is not of itself alone fit for purpose as it stands. Because at the moment, the government can't really see what the value to the real economy is of the investment in a rail scheme. Or indeed the value of a potential investment in one sector, such as housing, compared to the value of investment in the transport sector. At the moment, the appraisal methods are different, and investment decisions are not made on the basis of their potential wider economic value, but on other factors, primarily, again, as in terms of the journey reduction times. So essentially, the welfare benefits to existing users maximised over time. This is a sound approach, and it does give you a BCR that at least allows you to see that the welfare benefits of the investment that you are making, that you will at least get a return on that investment. But in actual fact, we believe that it should be much more about seeing what schemes, what projects can maximise economic growth. And we published a discussion paper, which is littered around outside, a couple of weeks ago. And that called for a new methodology for appraising infrastructure investment that puts the economy front and centre. And this would also enable government in kind of related sectors such as housing and regeneration to make assessments based on a level playing field between those projects and identify what can best be done to stimulate economic growth. With limited money available, it's unlikely to simply be different transport modes that can compete on this basis. There's inevitably going to be needs to be trade-offs between related sectors in order to get the best mix of infrastructure investment to maximise those economic benefits. Sometimes it will be rail, sometimes it might be a regeneration project or a housing development. It might be a mix of all three. And competing infrastructure sectors need to be mature enough to accept this and really, frankly, to embrace it. Rail has, I see the guys from ACE up here, the industry is already planning how we need to grow the railway in the period from 2014 to 19. It's central to this planning process that we prioritise the importance of projects based on business cases that shows what the railway can do for the economic well-being of the nation as a whole. And these projects, those projects that do that are going to be among those that we recommend to government as an industry are taken forward. A new methodology will help us to make the case for rail even more robust than it is today. It will help us to prove the value of key rail infrastructure projects in stimulating growth. It will help us to prove that good rail links stimulate private sector-led growth by encouraging businesses to invest in our towns and cities. It will help us to prove that faster, more frequent railway links increase labour market flexibility, allowing people to look for jobs further from home than before, and giving employers a wider catchment from which to recruit. It will help us to prove that rail is the form of transport best placed to help build a low-carbon economy for Britain. Rail contributes only 2% of the country's carbon emissions compared to roads, which contribute 23%. And we strongly believe that investing in rail is a vital step towards meeting the government's target of an 80% cut in carbon emissions by 2050. This means that committed schemes like Thameslink must be allowed to deliver their full benefits. And despite limited funding, proposed rail projects must also be considered on the basis of their individual economic merit. If by providing more journeys or faster journeys, rail schemes can significantly help to promote private sector investment, then the government cannot afford to give them, not to give them fair consideration. If the business case for them is so strong that it's blindingly clear that they pay the nation back time and time again, then there's a responsibility to the economy to deliver them. The proposed Northern Hub, we're in Manchester obviously, is a good example of one such scheme. By unlocking existing constraints and bottlenecks on the railway network in the north, the Northern Hub would deliver 700 more trains a day across the region. Between many towns and cities, this would make the difference between having to look at a timetable before you travel and simply having to turn up at the station knowing there will be a train within minutes. It wouldn't only accommodate the 39 to 54% passenger growth we're expected to see across the north of England over the next decade, but by improving connectivity and labour market flexibility will attract investment to the north of England as a whole. It's not just a rail project, essentially is what I'm saying. It's an infrastructure investment which offers the potential to transform the economy of the north. It's one of the best examples of how transport investment will future-proof the economy by making Britain more productive and more competitive. I'm sure, again, that the Shadow Secretary of State would agree with me that when it comes to planning infrastructure that will drive recovery and promote sustainable economic growth, short-termism is not acceptable. This investment, we believe, is not a luxury, it's a necessity.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Right, well, we've got time for some questions. If you'd like to raise your hands, if you'd like to say who you are and where you're from before asking, that would be great. Gentleman just there.
Yeah, thanks. My name's Steve Donnelly. I've got no connection with the business, as it were. Very interesting contributions. I mean, I guess one thing that struck me though was that if we went back 3 years, I don't think you guys would be presenting in fundamentally different terms. What didn't strike me really was what was so different about the austerity part, because much of what you said was the sort of common sense language about the need for infrastructure investment, which has been going on for, you know, all of my life, you know, and I'm nearly 30, you know. And so that was one part of it that hit me. The other part, and maybe, you know, this is maybe semantics, but the phrase used was the government agrees we need to invest. I disagree. Governments agree that investment should be made. They don't agree that we need to invest. That's a separate hurdle, and one that's normally much higher and more difficult to get over. So it's that balance between public and private sector investment. Where is it going to come from? And in terms of Stephen's point, surely in terms of what we've seen from the coalition government so far, it's the antithesis of your point about what you might call low-hanging fruit or short-term delivery, because the one project that they've chosen to big up is the high-speed link to Birmingham, which, you know, in the context that we're talking about, they might as well be talking about a sort of, you know, 2,200, you know, fast track to the moon. You know, this is the ultimate. Make it sound as though you've got radical ideas to invest, but in fact, in the short term, you're not doing anything of the kind. And all of the very valid points you've all made seems to show there's still a paralysis or a stasis in which the points about economic development are not the paramount points, or the bang for the buck isn't the overwhelming argument. And I guess it made me think that when I travelled up here from West London on much improved tubes, on a much improved train, on a much improved track, it made it feel like it being Britain, it all almost happened by accident.
Okay, thank you very much. Stephen.
All of that's really thought-provoking, and I think you're absolutely right to challenge us on kind of what's different about austerity. I guess what it's done is to throw into much sharper relief some of the things that the arguments that were already around, but also to decide to take a look at the bathwater that's been thrown out by the coalition and identify the babies in it and disappearing out the window as well, of which there are rather a lot. Just to give you an example, one of the things that seems to me that seems to us that you absolutely need for transport above all, and I think to do injustice, Philip Hammond recognises this, but not all his county colleagues do, is you need some strategic direction. You need that nationally, with some kind of strategic planning framework, and you also need it locally. And if you look at, let us say, Manchester's competitors, they do not deal with, you know, a sort of passenger transport executive that doesn't have any control over its highways. You have strong city regions authorities that can do strategic planning and transport together, and can get private sector involvement through that, and give private sector the certainty, if you like, that and crucially, they raise their own revenue. And one of the things that I think, again, we probably have some common ground with policy exchange is that other countries fund a large proportion of particular city and public transport by a very wide range of revenue raising, property taxes, sales taxes, locally raised revenues, and all of which aren't particularly open to British local government. And I think it hobbles UK cities compared to those that they face in competition. So I think what we're seeing instead is this government. As I say, it's not. This isn't Philip Hammond. This is Eric Pickles we're talking about. Taking regional housing targets, top-down regional housing targets, and throwing out the entire regional planning or sub-national planning framework out of the window, which means that developers of any sort, whether to do in transport or any other development, have very little certainty on what to invest. And just to take some transport examples, Eric Pickles has thrown out 2 rail freight terminals in the last couple of months on the basis that local authorities didn't like them, so that's the end of the story. So there's clearly, that's clearly going to be a huge issue. Just about the low-hanging fruit point, in fact the government has announced a local sustainable transport fund last week, which will, I think, help some of this, and it was based on Labour's own challenge fund, but nonetheless, as Miliband said, you need to take, to talk about good ideas across the spectrum. The High Speed 2 point, I take your point. Based on the comments I made, I actually think there is probably a case for high-speed rail, despite all the things I said about the forecasting, but it would need to be a very different high-speed rail. For example, it would need to take account of the possibility of using the released capacity on the West Coast Main Line to locate new housing and warehousing development, so you could have rail-friendly development for freight and passenger along that line. Now that's a light years from where the coalition is, but it would be in principle a justified strategy, and almost every other European country, including even Japan and places like Japan as well, would see that as the way in which they develop. We, on the contrary, have had a situation where, for example, in the 1960s, a decision was taken to designate Milton Keynes as a new town, and the same week, by the Ministry of Housing and Local Government, and the same week the Ministry of Transport announced the closure of the Oxford-Cambridge railway line that ran through Milton Keynes. So we've had a tradition of not doing this. Almost every other country, including actually a lot of US cities, have done a lot better than that way.
Thank you. Andrew, do you want to make a couple of brief comments?
Yep. So one is that I think that it changes the balance of the argument a little. So of course I would have been arguing 3 years ago that you want to be looking forward rather than back, but I think that the scope of that argument, so when I would have had in mind a fairly narrow set of cases, I think that the scope of the uncertainty is increased by the recession. I think that also changed the balance between doing when 3 years ago I might have been saying you should do something different. Now I think that there's more cases in which you might not do anything for now and wait till later. I also think that there are additional uncertainty, particularly significant additional uncertainties associated with austerity specifically, as opposed to the recession broadly, that relate to questions such as taxes. Right, the outlook for taxes, so you've got a particular dependency there, and there are also things related to inflation and interest rates and growth, which obviously greater uncertainties as arising from the recession. I think that there are, that you increase some, because of the recession, you increase some of the arguments related to local funding rather than central funding, the balance of those arguments. And the final set of things I'd say that change is that you will have in mind different financing models. So whereas 3 years ago you might have had in mind particularly debt-based models for financing of various sorts, and might have been interested in more interested in even government-supported guarantored debt and so on. And you might have also been interested in related schemes, perhaps extending the role of PFI. And now I think a lot of that stuff's dead, and you're much more interested in equity. One consequence of which is you start being interested in the owners as well as the financing. Because the equity, you've got some particular shareholders. How broad is that? Is there an element of ownership, for example, by local authorities in some of these things?
Okay. Can I take this gentleman? If you could keep your questions relatively snappy, that would be appreciated, because we've got quite a few people who'd like to.
My name is Kevin Hutchins. I'm ex officio. I was Labour's parliamentary candidate in Angus at the last general election, and I have a particular interest in the East Coast Main Line. My question is mainly to Ed Wilson. I would have liked to ask it to the Minister, but I'll ask it to Ed because I think he's possibly placed to answer this question. And that is Network Rail committed to supporting the infrastructure of the London to Aberdeen route in order to ensure that through East Coast trains from London to Aberdeen have a sustainable future? And that's in the context of it's particularly important to the oil industry and workers who come up to the oil industry as well as important impact to the base at Condor, which is many of the troops actually use that line to actually go back to the North East.
Is there a reason why you think we might not be committed to that?
Well, no, it's not. It's not so much yourself. I think that there is a concern that the East Coast main line may actually, the East Coast route, perhaps, the East Coast service there, might actually have its through services stopped at Edinburgh, and people might actually have to travel through from Edinburgh to Aberdeen, and that has been a concern that's been expressed publicly.
Right, okay.
Over the past few years, particularly since we're obviously coming up for a period of some form of tendering for that particular service.
Yeah, well, I'm not that close to the detail on that, I have to say, but I've not heard anything about that at all. I'm happy to take it away and check that, but
Yeah.
I don't see why we would be committed to that.
Actually, Andrew Foster's review of the Intercity Express project specifically said that one of the ways of saving money on the Intercity Express project was to make it electric only and make everybody change at Edinburgh and not run through trains from King's Cross to Aberdeen. So that's, as it were, one option sitting on the government's desk at the moment. It's not a Network Rail issue, and it's possibly, except unless you want to talk about extending electrification to Aberdeen, which has been a long argument in Scotland. But that's where one of the arguments. That's where the arguments come from.
That study is again. So
It was a study commissioned actually by the last government into whether the Intercity Express train should continue to be built, and what the alternative options were. Instead of doing one that was diesel and electric, one of the options was to make it electric only and stop all the trains at Edinburgh and make a good change.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm going to take a couple of questions. Gentleman at the back and the gentleman there.
Yeah, my question is also about the East Coast main line. David Abraham, Durham International Rail Freight Terminal. The main line is considerably overloaded, and I was just wondering what are the prospects of having a dedicated freight system throughout the country, bearing in mind that would only cost £2 or £3 billion put into operation, I understand, and then we could have all the container wagons and double deck and a proper freight system throughout the country to take the excess traffic off the roads and all the benefits that train travel gives.
Great, thank you very much. Gentleman there.
When we're comparing road and rail, road lies very firmly in the public sector, rail is in the private sector. You can argue about where Network Rail actually fits. But a lot of capacity issues on rail could be solved in a different way. Yes, infrastructure projects again, great high speed rail and all that. But you just go and stand down Oxford Road Station here, you see an awful lot of 2 or 3 coach trains coming through. Those could be 4 coaches, they could be 6 coaches. But the problem is that the coaches don't exist. All of the rolling stock fleets are being used to the maximum capacity, and I've just recently retired as service planning manager for Arriva Trains Wales. So I know that. So we don't actually need huge investment from our Network Rail colleagues to considerably increase the carrying capacity of the train services we've got. But the structure we've got makes the private sector involvement in rail totally risk averse. Nobody, the rolling stock companies will not build rolling stock on spec. A train company like Arriva Trains Wales, which is tied into a subsidy profile, my shareholders would not have thanked me for leasing more coaches, because the more trains we run, the more money we lose. That's in the nature of rail operations. So somehow or other, we don't actually need these sort of massive, sexy projects of infrastructure investment to substantially increase the carrying capacity of the network. We just need some more coaches, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Ed, do you want to?
Yeah, just first on David's point about the freight-only line. To be honest, David, I don't think that's ever likely to happen. I mean, we've got a project at the moment to upgrade the joint line to take some of the freight traffic off the East Coast main line that will increase capacity there, but I don't think that it's ever likely to see a freight-only network, to be honest. In terms of the point about the rolling stock, clearly it's been a significant problem for the government, and you're right that it's not just investment in the fixed infrastructure, it's investment in the moving infrastructure as well that's needed for capacity.
Yeah, well, I agree. I think that in the current circumstances, doing a dedicated freight network, I'm not sure 2 or 3 billion quite covers it actually. What you do need actually is to safeguard the investment that was committed by the last government into the strategic freight network that will actually provide a lot of the capacity that the rail freight needs. And Tony may want to comment more on this, but it seems to me that's the core thing, and keeping grants for rail freight going, because those are the things that will actually, in the short term, make a difference and actually enhance capacity. Just about the capacity, sorry, I didn't mean to imply that high-speed rail was the answer. I just wanted to say that there was probably a case for it, despite all the modelling that high-speed 2 did. But it would need to be a different kind of thing. The point I wanted to make, I mean, you're absolutely right about new trains. Actually, I think it's one of the consequences of the past trends, continuing past trends forecasting, because actually I've discovered that certain officials in the DfT don't actually believe that there are capacity problems in the north of England, because Beeching and Serple told them there weren't, and that basically, as one senior official told me, if we were told to save 600 million, what we'd probably do is shut northern trains because some people up here. And so, because they don't actually believe that there are worse overcrowding, as in fact is the case on commuter services into Manchester and Leeds than there is on some London lines, because, as I say, the passenger demand forecasting thing tells them that. Because why would you have that? So actually, which means the Department of Transport have pulled the authorisation of new diesel trains to the north of England. An alternative is to electrify and cascade, but that's also on hold. And that, you're absolutely right, that's where you can get some decent use of capacity, and not just around here, but also in the south east.
Thank you. Gentleman there and gentleman at the back.
Michael Rolls from the Association of Train Operating Companies. A question for all the panel. The last government had a policy of shifting the burden for paying for rail from the taxpayer to the passenger. And in an age of austerity, there's little sign that the current government is going to move away from that policy. If anything, would be inclined perhaps to move even further down that trajectory. At the same time, all political parties are saying that it's a good thing to attract more people and indeed more freight into the railways. Can we have both aspirations?
Gentleman at the back.
Good evening. David Layton, AVP. Just a quick question about DfT appraisal methodology. If we accept that there is a great deal of uncertainty going forward, isn't that in fact potentially a reason for looking towards long-term historical trends as a basis for our transport planning in the future? And if you talk about or have a preference for what you describe, Stephen, as scenario planning, how then do you determine, having identified a range of scenarios, which is the right scenario to go for?
Andrew,
I think it's absolutely the case that one's likely to see more emphasis on passengers paying. It's plausible that one looks to have, in fact, over one might think of as a medium term, so perhaps not next year or the year after, but not too long after that, some changes in some of the structure of the way in which subsidies work in the rail sector. So it's possible that, for example, you could focus central subsidies, where you might eliminate most central subsidies altogether, and that if a local area had a good case for having a particularly subsidised service, that might be the responsibility of the local area to deal with it and be encompassed within a local area grant. That, for example, was one of the proposals in the Policy Exchange paper on the changes to rail sector that came out last week. And a different kind of concept might be to move away from the model of rail franchising that we brought in with privatisation in the UK. So if we're thinking, if one thought of more exotically, you could imagine models in which instead of there being you bidding for particular franchises, you could bid for particular moving windows, particular times. So you could imagine that that people, it's not that people run lots and lots of they have responsibility for a whole area. It's rather that they purchase the right to run the track at particular times. So those kind of schemes obviously involve fairly exotic or auctioning, and they're quite complicated to manage. But it could be that they become within the techniques of working out how to make these things work, advanced to the point at which those sorts of concepts might become feasible. At that point, you'd have very, very targeted subsidies involved, because people would then bid for a subsidy of a very particular line at a very particular time, and that might allow you to be much more efficient in the targeting of your subsidies, allowing them to be reduced in certain areas and increase the overall efficiency. It seems to me that the scope for efficiency with regards to some of these things is sufficiently high that yes, I think that it is still possible that you could have both an increase in the role of the passenger and an increase in the volume here. I think that there still remains scope to do that. It's obviously not straightforward to make that happen, but I still think that should be the ambition.
Well, shall I just go in on Michael's question in terms of both aspirations? I think yes. I think that at the moment the rail industry costs approximately £11 billion per year, and I think it's the government at the moment is putting in about £5 billion of that, and £6 billion is coming from the passenger, from the fare box. I think that it's really about reducing the overall quantum of that 11 billion, and I think simply by doing that you reduce the need for government subsidy, and by definition the proportion that the passengers currently pay, even if that does increase slightly in terms of the actual monetary number, the percentage could increase dramatically through that. But I think it's, in terms of attracting people at the same time to the railway, I think that the service, as you know, continues to improve and attract more people. That's one of the reasons why passenger numbers are going up, because satisfaction with the service is going up. So if that continues to improve, then I don't see why the two things are mutually exclusive.
Stephen, do you want to touch on the second question?
Yes, I will. The problem is that if you plan on the place is actually full of white elephants that have been kind of built to plan on past trends. And I think particularly given the uncertainties that Andrew and I sketched out around, say, oil price and carbon and so on, as well as the ones that Andrew talked about in terms of demographics. I mean, we've seen in relation to rail freight even quite short timescale changes on, for example, the price of gas having a big impact on, imported coal and therefore volumes of rail freight. I mean, those are really big things. And if you'd planned, say, 40 years ago on the basis of rail freight, you'd be building a lot of, you've sort of done a lot of work for some power stations and coal mines that have now been closed down. So that's why I think what you plan for is not, this isn't to say you don't do planning. What you do, as I said, is to work what's robust over a plausible range of scenarios. Not you pick one scenario and then go after it. You look at what's going to be robust against a good range of uncertainties. And particularly now, over the shorter term, and invest in that. I mean, actually, if people want to see more detail on that, there's a very detailed paper by Professor Phil Goodwin, which talks about all of this, and actually has done some very detailed work on value for money in nature and what the schemes are, looking at a very wide range of schemes and what gives good value for money in short and long term. Mostly looking at passenger, I think it's fair to say, not at freight, but it's a very interesting paper, which has come out in the last few weeks looking at that. Just about the taxpayer and fare payer, I mean, there's a group that's been campaigning on rail fares. You'll expect me to say that we can have our cake and eat it, but I do actually think that it's really that we need to take a look at some wider arguments here, which are about carbon competitiveness. Carbon, because one of the things that has been the case is that rail and actually particularly bus fares have increased in real terms while motor and aviation have fallen, which in carbon terms is the wrong answer, and government needs to address that. Now, if the Liberal Democrat part of the coalition succeeds in doing things on green taxes and manages to change those equations, that might, that's a wider context that you need to look at. The government needs to actually decide that, rather than just let rail fares rip, go for a very high RPI, and at the same time introduce a fare fuel stabiliser that actually brings down the cost of motoring and ducks anything on aviation taxes, because the actual flying matters crowd have been here are kind of more than they've got to. So that's the first thing, carbon competitiveness in a situation in which, as Passenger Focus showed last year, rail fares, particularly in London and the South East, are overall 20% above European average. Then there's, and I don't see much sign of other cities kind of going after large-scale increases, real increases. A situation you went for, RPI plus 3, RPI plus 5, with some of the scenarios that have been talked about. You don't go very far down that road. In fact, by the end of this Parliament, you'd be in a situation where London was in danger of pricing itself out of the international market simply on commuting costs. And clearly there are trade-offs to be made on housing costs and other things. But I just point out that there's a competitiveness argument you have to take account of. On the answers, I think, like Ed says, it's about bringing down overall costs. It's about actually letting operators, giving more incentives to raise and keep revenues. That's part of the value for money study. I think it's about the external funding I talked about, actually, and enabling external funding to come into the industry and to be kept there in terms of funding things. Charging external costs, we've calculated that moving from RPI plus 1 to RPI is equivalent to the revenue you get in from charging fuel tax on domestic aviation. So that's an example. And I think it's a big issue about simplification of the fare structure, which nobody, either in the industry or government, has been prepared to touch, because there are going to be some large losers as well as winners. But in terms of actually making the rail network more simple and usable, it seems to me that actually having some much simpler and headline fares are going to be critical for this.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Yep. Tony Barclay, Rail Freight Group. Stephen, on your question of congestion up north, it's because politicians and officials never come up north, with a few notable exceptions. It's a general comment, on rail freight, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we need scenarios for projecting future growth. I mean, our last ones were between 2 and 3 times in 20 years growth. It'll change now, but at least there's a range there. But you can do an awful lot by running longer trains and doing small improvements, as you said, Stephen, and Ed has said. But there's also this thing that nobody will touch. The best example is at Felixstowe, where there's about 31 trains, freight trains a day, go in and out of the single line to the port at Crystal Nile. But there's an hourly passenger train that goes up and down, which is fully used in the peak service, but in the middle of the day it's got a couple of grannies, and with nobody on it at all. Now, political courage would put those 2 grannies on an air-conditioned bus provided free by Hutchison, and you get 20% more trains all the way from Felixstowe to wherever. And if this is where policy exchanges, I think you produced a paper, or you leaked a paper or something to the Sunday Times a couple of weeks ago.
We published a paper, that's the one Andrew was mentioning.
That's the one Andrew's talking about. That's right. If all franchises are to operate without any public subsidy at all, that would be one that could be cut between Felixstowe and Ipswich, and probably 1 or 2 others.
Yeah. Sorry, gentleman there.
Tom Smith from the Go Ahead Group. I'm also a colleague of Michael's on the board of ATOC. I want to come back on something Andrew said, which I think may well be in your paper, about a different model of franchising. You acknowledge that it was, the detail will be quite difficult to think through with this example of train companies buying access at certain times of the day. I think it would be operationally very challenging and potentially very, very inefficient in terms of the utilisation of resources. One of the themes we've talked about is rolling stock and how that can be used to best effect. If you don't use a fleet in a holistic fashion over the entire course of the day and over your entire network, you are building in quite significant inefficiencies because you need more trains than you would otherwise. And the same would be true of train crews. So I have to say that that model sounds like a model for an age of profligacy and not far from austerity.
Well, that isn't actually a model discussed in the paper last week. But B, so what you would need to do, of course, would be that you'd need to purchase a set of windows across a day. So you wouldn't want to just have one. So it'd be very complicated to set up the auction or the tendering process that allowed you to bid for an efficient series of windows, and so it would be very computationally demanding and very sophisticated to work out what the bidding strategies and so on are. I'm merely describing. So I'm merely describing that kind of a thing. If you could make that kind of a thing work, so that you had much more targeted competition between different players, even along the similar lines, then it's a different model of competition from that in which all you do is that you compete for the market in terms of having a franchise. If you compete within the market in this different way, or you compete in a much more focused way, then there must be scope for efficiency gains from that. Now, it might. I'm describing that as one sort of thing to explain the thought that there are efficiency improvements that could be made. I'm not suggesting that that's something that could be
No,
implemented
I understand.
tomorrow.
You're proposing possible efficiencies through better application of market mechanisms. What I'm saying is that can also, that's slightly theoretical, and it can lead to operational inefficiency that actually drives cost in the wrong direction.
Yeah, absolutely correct.
And actually, since we've never managed to get to open slot auctioning at airports or road user charging, then actually putting the railways through something like that would kind of be a slight competitive disadvantage.
If I'm not trespassing too much on my time, I wanted to come back on something Stephen said as well about fares. We as train operators are regularly abused and pummeled over fares, but actually if you step back and look at the facts of the dramatic increase in passenger numbers that have been since the introduction of private sector train operators, we must be getting something right. We are selling our product and people are buying it, and they're not put off because they allegedly think it's complex or challenging.
Okay, thank you very much. Gentleman there and gentleman behind.
Yep. John Cook from the Mobile Operators Association, the Telecoms Trade Association. Of course, it's got nothing to do with my day job, but more from personal interest. Give you a quick comment on the very high-speed link London to Birmingham. I've got a problem with it, which is that it stops in Birmingham. I'm a closet Glaswegian. So can you comment on the reason for stopping in Birmingham and not going all the way north?
Gentleman, if I choose.
Chris Moll, I was the rail minister until the general election, when I lost my seat. I was actually going to make the point about the elasticity in demand, given that there's been this 60% increase in passenger numbers with the prices that we've got, and also wanted to look at the relationship between fares and subsidies in different parts of the country. Broadly, if you add up all of the premia paid by TOCs paying premia, they equate to the subsidy that's paid to Northern Rail. And so for the scenario that I think Ed might have suggested, that if you wanted to save 600 million, you chopped Northern Rail.
It was I know.
Wherever I came from on the top, don't want to apportion blame inappropriately. That would rely on the London and other TOCs continuing to produce the surpluses that they do. The link between that and the carriages issue is that even at a time when the government was committed to 1,300 unit carriage capacity, the struggle with the capacity demands in some of the northern cities, which I visited last summer, was that the overcapacity figures are not actually that significant in comparison to many of the London ones in terms of Pixie data, the passengers in excess of capacity data by and large. And the real problem that you have is that if you've got a one coach service, which is 10% over capacity, you stick another coach on, which you've got to pay for, it's 90% fresh air. If you've got an 8-car train, and there are the problems that not all trains can be incremented in one carriage capacity, but if you've got an 8-car train, say, which is 10% over capacity, and you put another carriage on, that carriage is 80% full. So the challenge is that although there is overcrowding in carriages in some of the northern cities, it doesn't automatically translate into a business case for that reason, and for the second reason, that the fares are substantially suppressed on trains in the north, and therefore the cases that are being put to the DFT, irrespective of the wider appraisal relationships that Stephen was referring to between road and rail, just within rail comparing investment proposals, those business cases weren't standing on their own effectively enough to justify the rollout of some of those additional cases. It did work with electrification, which is why continuation with electrification that was proposed by the last government is actually so critical. And I think to bring it back to your theme for the evening, which was in the age of austerity, I would say the question you have to ask is, does climate trump austerity? And that's where I think rail can, but in the last general project, Stephen, because we need to have more of a discussion about this, one of the issues in the longer term is that as we move to electric vehicles, and the DFT assumptions assume significant numbers of electric vehicles from sort of 2015, 2016 onwards, the carbon cost in the road appraisals begins to go rapidly down in relation to other. I'll leave you with that.
Yeah, just a couple of points on that. Chris mentioned the premium tool paid by all the other operators adding up to the subsidy to Northern. I think that probably just reflects the contribution that railway makes beyond the kind of economic contribution it can make, and I think it kind of reflects Tony's point about the political cojones that would be needed to, even just to remove those two kind of services in the middle of the day. In terms of fares, I mean, I travel by train a lot. And in actual fact, I would find fares of pretty good value a lot of the time. I appreciate that's not always the case. And on HS2, I think that the government's indicated that it intends this to be the first stage. And when the HS2 report came out in March, there's actually a Y which uses existing infrastructure to take it beyond Rugeley in Staffordshire.
Briefly, yes. High Speed 2 isn't going to stop in Birmingham. There is, the brief they've been given is to do detailed scoping out to Leeds, via the East Midlands, and I think towards Manchester as well, in the Y shape that Ed just referred to. So it isn't just a stop. And there's in the High Speed 2 thing, you'll find a full network that looks like a sort of inverse A. Going all the way to Glasgow, in fact. I take the point about the fares and subsidy argument. Actually, we couldn't find any Pixie data for Northern. It only seems to be collected for South East trains. In fact, we did a stunt a year or two back of a sardine man. We took somebody dressed as a sardine man, the 10 most overcrowded trains in the country, got into a dreadful argument with your predecessors about what were the 10 most overcrowded trains in the country, because actually there isn't any data for a lot of non-South East services. But I take the point that I think the problem is that actually what you've got is a lot of suppressed demand in the non-London cities, and that actually you wouldn't be carrying around fresh air in those places. And as I say, I think it's a past trends continuing problem that kind of tells you that's the case. I take the point about low fares. I wasn't defending every single fare at the moment as is, because I think there are some issues about that, particularly where you've got where you've got particularly a case where you've got very low rail fares and actually the bus fares are higher, then you've really got to start asking some questions about the balance there. So I wouldn't disagree with that. I'd only make the point that moving to a straight airline model in which everybody books ahead and has to book ahead, well ahead, as opposed to the reserved seat model, which is what the TGVs have, for instance, where you can turn up 5 minutes before as long as the seat can get on the train. Seems to be different. And if you say to somebody whose relative has just been taken ill and who needs to get from Manchester to London urgently, you're going to hear it's £200 or nothing, then it seems to me that is pricing people off the railway for walk-on journeys, which the railway, particularly when it's got 3 trains an hour to London, ought to be very good at. And I do say that the complexity of the system, actually, I think it reduces some of the, it stops you filling some off-peak seats that you otherwise could do. Because if you say to somebody says, what's it going to cost me to get from, say, Twickenham to Birmingham, then actually the answer is which operator, what time do you want to travel, when you're coming back, can you predict, there's lots of questions, lots of go to. And I think I think the mobile phone industry might have something to teach the industry, and maybe when we move to smart cards, that will perhaps start to happen.
Free weekends?
Yes, so that's well, actually, if I have a gold card, a network gold card, which does give me very cheap travel access to the network at weekends, I think it does drive a lot of traffic actually from conservation in the southeast, and fill seats that otherwise wouldn't be used at marginal cost, which is kind of what we want to have.
Great, well, I think we're going to wrap up now. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much to our panel, to Andrew, Ed and Stephen. Thank you all very much for coming, to Network Rail for supporting this event. We shall ensure that the Shadow Minister gets a copy of the video of this event so he can hear all your interesting comments. So thank you very much indeed.